Look at the photograph. Really look at it. A city of white palaces stretching past the horizon, domes that rival the Vatican, columns 3 stories tall, statues lining canals so still the water looks like poured glass, arches carved with a level of detail that would take a team of modern stonemasons years to reproduce. Buildings that cast reflections so crisp in those calm, flat basins that you have to look twice to figure out which half of the image is real, and then somebody tells you the whole thing was made of plaster, that it went up in roughly 2 years, that almost all of it was torn down or burned within 12 months of the day it opened. That somebody is the history books, and for over a century that has been the official answer. The Chicago White City was temporary. It was decoration. It was a stage set for a World's Fair, and stage sets get struck. But there is a growing community of people who look at these same photographs. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. And refuse to accept that explanation. They are not satisfied, and the more you actually study what was built in Chicago in 1893, the harder it becomes to wave their questions away. This is the story of the White City, and it is the story of why so many people now believe you were handed the plaster explanation on purpose. To understand the argument, you first have to understand the scale of what happened on the shore of Lake Michigan. In 1893, Chicago hosted the world's Columbian Exposition, a fair meant to mark 400 years since Columbus reached the Americas. But before a single column was raised, there was a competition, and it was a fierce one. New York had lobbied hard to host the fair on its own ground. So had Washington. So had St. Louis. Chicago won the bid in 1890, and it won by outspending and outpromising everyone else in the room. The city had something to prove, and the people in charge of the fair knew it. The man placed in charge of actually building it was the architect Daniel Burnham. His nickname was "Make No Little Plans," a phrase attributed to him so often it became his epitaph. And what Burnham and his collaborators produced was not a collection of booths and tents. It was, by every surviving account, a fully realized neoclassical metropolis. Burnham assembled an almost unprecedented concentration of architectural talent. Richard Morris Hunt designed the administration building. Charles McKim, William Meade, and Stanford White contributed major structures. Louis Sullivan designed the transportation building, the one pavilion that broke from the classical white uniformity and instead erupted in golden ornamental arches that became one of the most photographed doorways of the decade. Frederick Law Olmsted, who had already designed Central Park in New York, laid out the grounds and the waterways. These were not apprentices. These were the defining figures of American design, gathered in one place for one project. And what they built was not a fairground. It was a city. At its center sat the Court of Honor, sometimes called the Grand Basin, a long rectangular lagoon flanked on every side by enormous buildings in gleaming white. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building alone covered more than 30 acres under a single roof, a number that meant nothing until you tried to walk its perimeter, which took the better part of an hour. Inside its halls, exhibitors from 50 nations displayed everything from German machinery to Japanese silk to American steam engines, and the floor space was so vast that fair administrators put small railways inside it to move visitors from one end to the other. There were palaces dedicated to agriculture, to machinery, to electricity, to fine art. The Palace of Fine Arts housed thousands of works of art on loan from museums and collections across the globe, and when visitors walked its neoclassical corridors, they walked past originals that had never before crossed an ocean. The Electricity Building was considered one of the most revolutionary spaces of the entire fair, a place where Thomas Edison himself had exhibits on display, where visitors encountered electric lights in the kind of density most of them had never imagined possible. At night, when 80,000 incandescent bulbs lit the grounds all at once, the experience reportedly stopped people in their tracks. Many had never seen electric light at all. Most had never seen it like this. There was a peristyle of columns, There was a golden statue of the Republic standing 65 feet tall above the water, a figure so large and so gilded that she could be seen from ships on the lake. There were fountains and bridges and promenades, and a gondola service on the canals modelled on Venice. Along the waterfront, steam launches carried passengers around the lagoon so they could see the buildings from the water the way the architects had imagined them. 27 million people walked through it. In a country whose entire population was around 65 million at the time, that number is staggering. People came off the trains, stepped into the Court of Honor, and described it as something close to a religious experience. They called it the White City because it shone. Journalists exhausted their adjectives. Ministers wrote sermons about it. Henry Adams, who was by his own admission difficult to impress, stood in front of the Manufactures Building and wrote that it dwarfed anything he had seen in Europe. L. Frank Baum visited the fair and is widely believed to have drawn from it when he imagined the Emerald City. Buffalo Bill Cody ran a competing show just outside the fairgrounds that also drew enormous crowds, and still the White City itself was the destination everyone came to see. Now here is where the official story and the revisionist story split. The textbooks tell you the buildings were never meant to last. They were built around wooden and steel frames and coated in a material called staff. Staff was a mixture of plaster of Paris, cement, and jute fiber. You could mold it, paint it, and sculpt it to imitate marble and stone at a fraction of the cost and a fraction of the time. It was not a new invention. The material had been used at world's fairs going back decades. The Paris Exposition of 1889, the one that produced the Eiffel Tower as its signature structure, had used similar temporary construction throughout its pavilions. The Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition of 1876 had done the same. Building grand illusions for a season and then dismantling them was, in the world of international expositions, simply how things were done. The official line is simple. The fair was a celebration, money was tight, and there was no reason to build a permanent city you intended to demolish anyway. So they faked the stone. They made it beautiful. They made it temporary. And when the fair closed, they tore it down. A fire in 1894 finished off much of what remained. Clean, reasonable, and for most people, that is where the story ends. But the people who study these photographs keep coming back to the same set of problems, and once you hear them, they are difficult to unhear. Start with the craftsmanship. We are not talking about flat painted walls. We are talking about deeply sculpted friezes, fluted columns, allegorical statuary, and ornamentation packed into every surface, the kind of decorative density you find on cathedrals that took generations to complete. Look at the capitals of the columns, the layering of moulding at every cornice, the human figures carved into pediments and doorways. Photographs from inside the Manufactures Building show a coffered ceiling arching over the nave, with a precision and a beauty that most concert halls built to last 3 centuries would be proud to claim. The revisionist question is blunt. Who carves that level of detail into something they plan to bulldoze in 18 months? You do not commission that much beauty for a structure you have already scheduled for demolition. It is, they argue, the artistic equivalent of building a Swiss watch and then throwing it in the lake. Then there is the speed. The grounds were a swampy stretch of lakefront, the Jackson Park site, which had been used once before as fairgrounds and had reverted to marshland. In a window of roughly 2 years, with the tools and the labor available in the early 1890s, the official record says crews drained it, graded it, laid out the waterways, and raised a city of monumental buildings, some of them the largest structures in the world. The site covered nearly 700 acres. The Grand Basin alone required the excavation and hydraulic management of a large permanent body of water. The drainage and sewage systems installed beneath the grounds were sophisticated enough that contemporary engineers noted their quality. And all of this, the skeptics say, is supposed to have been designed from nothing, permitted, funded, excavated, framed, finished, and ornamented in the time it takes most American cities to build a single courthouse. The skeptics line up that timeline against that output, and they simply do not believe the math works. Either the labor was superhuman, they say, or the buildings were not built in the window we are told. And then comes the question that the whole theory turns on. If it was so magnificent, why destroy it? This is the emotional core of the revisionist case. Here was a city that millions of people described as the most beautiful thing they had ever seen in their lives. A place that inspired novelists, city planners, and an entire architectural movement called the City Beautiful. A place that made grown men weep when they saw it for the first time. And the answer we are given is that they knocked it down and burned it because it was too expensive to maintain. To the believers, that does not read like economics. It reads like erasure. You do not casually delete a wonder of the world. Unless, they argue, the point was that it not survive for too many people to examine up close. There is also the small matter of what the fair did to the people around it. The Columbian Exposition took place against a backdrop of one of the worst economic depressions in American history, the Panic of 1893. And yet the people streaming into the White City that summer described a sense of hope and wonder so acute it bordered on disorientation. They came from the wreckage of an economy in free fall, stepped through the gates, and found themselves in a city more beautiful than anything the waking world had ever offered. Then the gates closed, and the city died, and the fires came. The believers find the timing almost too neat, like a dream engineered to make the waking harder to bear. From that suspicion grows the larger framework, the one that ties the White City to a much bigger idea. You may have heard the name Tartaria. The Tartaria theory proposes that there existed a prior global civilization of extraordinary sophistication that produced the great neoclassical buildings scattered across every major city in the Northern Hemisphere, and that was then erased from the historical record through some combination of deliberate suppression and catastrophic event. The buildings, in this telling, did not get built in the 1800s. They were inherited, and the 19th century invented a paper trail of architects and construction contracts to explain away structures that were already standing. In this telling, the White City was not built for the fair at all. It was already there, or it was built using inherited techniques and knowledge passed down from that erased civilization, and the fair was the cover story. A temporary event was invented to explain the presence of buildings that the official timeline cannot otherwise account for. And the plaster, the staff, the talk of cheap temporary material becomes the most important detail of all. Because if you can convince the public that it was all fake stone, you remove the reason for anyone to ask how real stone like that came to be there in the first place. There is more that feeds the suspicion, and the community has catalogued all of it. They point to the strange shortage of construction imagery for the sheer volume of buildings. Yes, frame photographs exist, but for a project this colossal, the skeptics argue the documentation is oddly thin, and that the handful of construction shots we do have get leaned on again and again in every academic account. The official explanation is that photography was still expensive and logistically difficult in that era, but the skeptics note that the same fair produced thousands of finished photographs and an enormous published record. The machinery to document was clearly there. So why, they ask, is the construction documentation so sparse compared to the final product? They point to the canals and waterways threading through the grounds and ask how a temporary fair justified that level of permanent-looking civil engineering. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. The lagoons required actual hydrological management, actual integration with Lake Michigan's water table, a drainage system substantial enough that contemporary engineers noted its quality. You do not build infrastructure at that depth for something you intend to demolish in a year, or, the believers say, you do not build it at all. You inherit it. They point to the basements and lower floors of these structures and tie them into a much bigger idea that runs through this entire movement, the notion of buildings that appear to be partly sunk into the earth, as if an older world had been buried and the new century simply built on top of what it inherited. There are photographs from the fair showing doorways that appear to lead downward before they lead in, ground floors that skeptics argue look architecturally inconsistent with what sits above them, as though a different builder finished the upper stories on a foundation someone else laid. This is the mud flood theory in its Chicago application, the idea that a layer of earth covered much of the built world, and what we call the great building campaigns of the 19th century were really the process of excavating and reoccupying what was already there. In this framework, Chicago is not an isolated mystery. It is one data point among hundreds: grand exhibition halls, courthouses, train stations, and capitols across America and Europe, all sharing a suspiciously similar monumental style, all credited to a few short decades, all attributed to a generation that, according to the official record, was still riding horses and lighting its homes with gas. Washington, D.C., St. Petersburg, Vienna, Philadelphia, every major city in the developed world went through the same explosion of neoclassical architecture in the same narrow window, as though they were all drawing from the same template, the same knowledge base, the same source of already cut stone. To them, the White City is the clearest, best photographed example of a pattern they say is hiding in plain sight. And the destruction, in their reading, is the tell. Not just that it happened, but how thoroughly it happened. A handful of structures from the fair survived in some form. The vast majority did not. The Palace of Fine Arts is the famous exception, later rebuilt in stone by the city of Chicago and standing today as a museum, and the skeptics seize on that detail. If one building was worth saving in permanent material, why was everything else, every bit as magnificent by every surviving account, allowed to rot and burn? Why was there no movement to preserve the Manufactures Building, which was literally the largest building on Earth? The answer the mainstream gives is money. The answer the skeptics give is intent. What survived was meant to survive. What vanished was never supposed to be examined too closely once the crowds went home. That is the heart of the title question. Why would anyone need you to believe it was plaster? Because plaster is forgettable. Plaster is disposable. Nobody mourns plaster, nobody investigates plaster, and nobody asks how it was produced or who had the skill to produce it. Marble demands a quarry. Carved stone demands a craftsman with years of training. A sculpted building of real masonry demands a lineage, a tradition, a history of who taught whom and how the knowledge passed from generation to generation. Plaster closes all of those questions at once. The revisionist argument is that the cheapness of the material was not just a budget decision, it was the lock on the door. Now, in fairness, the documented record pushes back hard, and any honest look at this has to sit with that pushback. There are construction photographs. There are the bare frames going up, the lattices of wood and steel, the staff being applied over them like a skin. There are the records of the architects and contractors, and published accounts from visitors who watched construction underway and described workers swarming over scaffolding by the thousands. Staff was a known, common exhibition material of the era, used at World's Fairs before and after Chicago. Buildings made to dazzle for a season and then come down were not unusual. They were the entire point of an exposition. The Manufactures Building does not need to have been carved in granite for the experience of walking through it to have been extraordinary. A building 30 acres across produces a cathedral effect on any human nervous system that enters it, regardless of what the walls are made of. Scale and electricity and art from 50 nations will do that to a person all by themselves. And the destruction has an explanation that does not require a conspiracy. The fair left its organizers deep in debt. Maintaining a city of decaying plaster buildings through Chicago winters would have cost a fortune nobody had. The staff material, which had served its purpose brilliantly during the fair, was by all accounts already beginning to crack and separate within months of opening day. Much of the site sat neglected almost the moment the gates closed, and a Chicago winter plus deferred maintenance did considerable damage even before the fires came. Then in 1894, during the labor upheaval of the Pullman strike, fires swept through the grounds and consumed the great halls of the Court of Honor. The fire burned in a context of social chaos, and while arson has been suspected, the collapse of the buildings was neither mysterious nor difficult to explain. What the flames did not take, salvage crews and weather finished over the years that followed. There was no need to hide anything, the mainstream account says, because there was nothing left worth hiding. There was debt and rubble, and a city that had already moved on to the next emergency. It is also worth saying plainly that the timeline objections lean on a hunch rather than a measurement. The fair was not built by a handful of men with hand tools in a workshop. Tens of thousands of laborers worked the site, backed by the industrial muscle of a city that was, at that exact moment, one of the fastest-growing manufacturing and meatpacking hubs on the planet. Chicago had already rebuilt itself from the ground up after the Great Fire of 1871, which had destroyed 17,000 buildings and the homes of 100,000 people, and had done it in under 2 years. A workforce that could resurrect an entire urban core from ash could absolutely throw up a temporary city in 24 months, especially when the buildings were hollow shells of frame and molded staff rather than solid quarried stone. The speed feels impossible only if you forget what that particular city had just finished proving it could do. The craftsmanship argument runs into a similar wall when you examine it against the labor history of the time. The staffing companies that worked the fair brought in some of the most skilled ornamental plasterers and sculptors in the world. The late 19th century had a tradition of decorative plasterwork that modern construction has almost entirely abandoned, and these were specialists who had spent their careers producing exactly this kind of architectural ornament for courthouses and opera houses across the country. And knowing that a building will last only one season does not necessarily prevent the people who build it from caring desperately about how it looks. Sometimes it focuses them. So you have two stories standing on the same set of photographs. One says a brilliant architect and an army of workers built a glorious illusion, knew it was an illusion, and let it die because that was always the plan. The other says the illusion is the cover, that the buildings were too perfect and too permanent looking to be what we are told, and that the plaster explanation exists precisely because it makes the questions stop. And this is what makes the White City different from 100 other forgotten fairgrounds. The photographs survived. The witnesses wrote it all down. The scale was real. The beauty was real. The destruction was real. Every piece of this story is documented, and that is exactly why it refuses to die quietly. You are not staring at a blurry myth. You are staring at a hard, clear, photographed fact that 27 million people experienced and then watched vanish. That is not legend. That is not folklore. That is something that happened in living memory at the time of the photographs, to real people who kept the ticket stubs and wrote the diary entries and published the memoirs, and it still went away as completely as if it had been dreamed. The scale of the disappearance is part of what the believers cannot let go of. Photograph after photograph survives of the place in its full glory, every cornice, every dome, every sweep of colonnade, and then almost nothing survives of the place itself. Not one major structure. A building that was briefly the largest on Earth left almost no physical trace. When you walk Jackson Park today, you find grass and trees and a few fragments of landscape. The absence is so complete that it reads, to certain eyes, less like demolition and more like deletion. The believers will tell you to keep looking. Look at the domes. Look at the statuary. Look at the canals and the columns and the sheer, almost impossible ambition of it. Look at the way the buildings in every photograph seem to have been designed not just for scale but for permanence, with the kind of integrated horizontal coursing and weight distribution you put in walls meant to stand for centuries, not walls meant to host a summer fair. And then look at the date stamped on the official story and ask yourself whether the simplest explanation and the true explanation are always the same thing. They are not always the same thing. History has a long record of the simplest explanation being wrong, and being wrong specifically because someone with power had a reason to prefer the simple version. The revisionist instinct, stripped of its more elaborate claims, is not crazy. The question is where that instinct leads you, and how tightly you hold to it when the evidence pushes the other direction. Maybe it really was plaster. Maybe an entire civilization poured its genius into a city it knew would last a single summer, and then let the fire take it. That is, in its own way, an even stranger and more haunting idea than the conspiracy. A wonder built to be forgotten. 27 million people walked through the most beautiful place most of them had ever seen, and the people who built it always knew they would knock it down before the snow came. There is something in that story, the deliberate impermanence of magnificent things that cuts against a certain human instinct so hard it almost begs for a different explanation. We want beauty to be permanent. We want things that move us to be meant to last. Or maybe the people squinting at these old photographs are right to feel that something does not add up. That the story we were handed is a little too neat, a little too convenient, and a little too eager to make sure we never ask who could build a city like that, and why it had to disappear so completely, so fast, in a fire that started during a moment of social upheaval and consumed exactly the structures that would have been hardest to explain away. Either way, the White City is gone. The palaces are ash and rubble under a Chicago park, and the only thing left to study is the image, a frozen photograph of a place that was somehow both the most documented wonder of its century and the most completely erased. One building rebuilt in stone, the rest dust. The contracts filed somewhere in an archive, the architects all dead within a generation, the workers who built it scattered back to wherever the work took them next, with nothing left of what they made, except the pictures and the accounts of the people who wept when they walked through. So the next time someone tells you it was only plaster, sit with that word for a second. Plaster. The cheapest possible answer to the most beautiful city anyone in America had ever seen. The word that makes the questions stop. The word that turns a wonder into a budget line and a legend into a footnote. And ask yourself the question the official story would really rather you skip. What if the material was never the point? What if the point was that you would hear the word plaster, nod, and look away? And maybe that is the real lesson buried in the White City, whichever version you land on. We trust the tidy answer because the tidy answer asks nothing of us. It lets us file the impossible under solved and move on with our day. The people still squinting at these photographs are not all chasing a hidden empire. Some of them are just refusing to look away as quickly as they were supposed to. They are sitting with the discomfort of a wonder that existed, that millions touched and walked through and wept at, and that we let slip into ash and rubble in the span of a single year. That alone is strange enough to deserve a look. No secret civilization required. No global conspiracy needed. The official story, taken at face value and followed to its end, is already one of the most melancholy things in American history. The most beautiful city the country had ever produced, gone in 12 months by design. That deserves more than a paragraph and a word. Because that is the one thing every version of this story agrees on. They built something extraordinary on the shore of that lake. An army of people put up a city so beautiful it broke people open when they walked into it. And then, for reasons that satisfy some people completely and haunt others entirely, they made sure it was gone. What you do with that depends on which kind of person you are, the kind who files it and moves on, or the kind who keeps looking at the photograph. But either way, look at it first, really look at it, because it was real, it was there, and then it wasn't.